In 1983, General Motors was losing ground to Japanese automakers so fast that its own executives admitted they could not fix the problem from the inside. So they did something almost unthinkable. They built an entirely new car company from scratch, with a new factory, a new workforce agreement, and a culture designed to be the opposite of everything GM stood for. If you want to see how stories like this one unfold, subscribe to Forgotten Detroit. That company was Saturn. And here is the part that should bother you. It worked. Customers loved it. Dealerships became famous for treating buyers like people. The cars sold. Then GM spent the next 2 decades slowly strangling the very thing that made Saturn different, until there was nothing left worth saving. They killed it in 2010. The question this video is going to answer is not why Saturn failed, it is why GM made sure it would. By 1980, Japanese automakers held roughly 21% of the American car market. 3 years earlier, it had been under 10. That is not a trend. That is a collapse happening in real time. The cars doing the damage were not exotic or expensive. The Toyota Corolla, the Honda Civic, the Datsun 210. Affordable, compact, and crucially, they did not break. American buyers who had grown up assuming a new car meant a new set of problems were discovering that was not actually how it had to be. Word spread fast. GM's answer, for most of the 1970s, was to take existing platforms, bolt on different badges, and call them new cars. A Chevrolet became a Pontiac, became an Oldsmobile. The executives called it shared architecture. Customers called it being sold the same thing 3 times, and eventually stopped showing up. The numbers inside GM's own boardrooms told the real story. Internal studies confirmed that on quality metrics, fit, finish, reliability after 3 years, the Japanese manufacturers were not slightly ahead. They were operating in a different category entirely. GM's cost structure, its union agreements, its factory layouts, its management layers. Every piece of the machine was optimized for building large cars slowly and expensively. Compact cars, made for informed, skeptical buyers, required something the existing system could not produce. By 1983, leadership concluded that no amount of reorganization, no efficiency drive, no new model name applied to an old platform was going to close that gap. The system itself was the problem. Fixing it from inside meant you were still inside it. So the conclusion GM reached was stark. You cannot fix a broken system by working inside it. But the follow-up question was just as hard. If not inside it, then where? In 1982, a GM executive named Alex C. Mayer began assembling a small confidential team with a specific mandate. Not to design a new car, not to retool a factory, to build an entirely separate company, from scratch, that could compete with Japan on Japan's own terms. The project was given a code name, Saturn, not after the planet, after NASA's Saturn rockets. The choice was deliberate. This was supposed to be a moonshot. In 1983, GM chairman Roger Smith went public with the idea. A concept vehicle followed in 1984. Then, on January 7, 1985, Saturn Corporation was formally incorporated as a fully independent GM subsidiary, its own legal entity, its own leadership, its own labor agreement, negotiated separately from GM's existing UAW contracts, a detail that sent shockwaves through both management and union circles. The declared mission was 4 words: a different kind of company. That phrase was not marketing copy written after the fact. It was the founding instruction. Saturn was not meant to produce a better version of what GM already built. It was meant to prove that an American company, starting with a blank sheet, could match the discipline, consistency, and customer trust that Toyota and Honda had spent decades earning. That ambition was either going to change GM forever or expose every reason the old system existed in the first place. When GM chose Spring Hill, Tennessee as Saturn's home, the decision itself was a statement. Spring Hill was not an existing GM facility retooled for a new model. It was open farmland. Saturn broke ground in 1986 and began producing cars in July of 1990. Every square foot was built to a specific philosophy: The factory was fully vertically integrated, meaning engines, transmissions, and final assembly all happened under one roof. That level of consolidation was unusual for an American automaker in that era. GM's traditional plants depended on sprawling supplier networks and separate component facilities. Saturn's design cut those handoffs out entirely, which reduced variation and gave the team direct control over quality at every stage. The labor structure was just as deliberate. The UAW contract governing Saturn workers ran fewer than 5 pages. For context, GM's standard UAW agreement at the time ran to hundreds. There were no private offices for supervisors. Management and assembly workers shared the same cafeteria. The physical layout was not symbolic, it was functional. Flattening hierarchy meant faster communication and fewer layers between a problem on the floor and the person with authority to fix it. Workers were organized into cross-trained teams. Each team member could perform multiple jobs on the line, which eliminated the rigid job classification system that had slowed American plants for decades. More importantly, any individual worker had the authority to stop the production line the moment they identified a quality problem. Not flag it, not report it to a supervisor, stop it. That single policy represented a fundamental inversion of traditional factory logic, where stopping the line was considered a failure. At Saturn, stopping the line to catch a defect before it moved forward was the job done correctly. Toyota had built its reputation partly on exactly this principle. Saturn was not borrowing the idea casually, it was embedding it into the legal and physical structure of the facility from day one. The factory floor at Spring Hill was unconventional. The cars built on it were just as radical. GM gave the Saturn engineering team something almost no division inside the company had received in decades: a genuinely blank sheet. No existing GM platform to adapt. No shared architecture to conform to. The S-Series cars, which included the SL sedan, SC coupe, and SW wagon, were designed from the ground up on a purpose-built chassis that belonged exclusively to Saturn. The assembly process reflected that same independence. Saturn replaced the traditional fixed conveyor line with what workers called skillets, mobile scissor-jack platforms that carried both a car and its build team simultaneously through the assembly sequence. Each skillet could be raised or lowered to match an individual worker's height. That single mechanical change eliminated a constant source of repetitive strain injury and kept workers in a controlled, ergonomic position at every stage. The car moved with its team, rather than the team scrambling to keep pace with a fixed belt. The cars themselves were engineered around 3 specific, measurable advantages. First, the body panels were made from dent-resistant polymer rather than steel. They did not rust and returned to shape under minor impacts. Second, Saturn used a timing chain rather than the timing belt that most competitors relied on. Timing belts require scheduled replacement. Chains last the life of the engine. Third, fuel economy was competitive with the Japanese imports Saturn was directly targeting. None of these were marketing abstractions. Each one was something a buyer could verify in ownership. The polymer panels meant no rust after a Michigan winter. The timing chain meant no $400 maintenance interval. The fuel numbers were printed on the window sticker next to the competition's. The team inside Saturn understood they had built something that stood on its own. The question was whether GM, as an institution, would let it. Building a better car was only half the problem. The other half was selling it without poisoning the experience. By the early 1990s, the American dealership had a reputation that was almost a cultural joke. High-pressure salespeople, hours of back and forth, a sticker price that nobody actually paid, because the real negotiation happened in a back office while you waited on a plastic chair. Saturn's leadership looked at that process and decided it was incompatible with everything the brand stood for, so they eliminated it entirely. Every Saturn carried a fixed, published price. No negotiation, no dealer markup, no asking to speak to the manager to shave off another $300. The number on the window was the number you paid, full stop. Saturn called it one-price selling, and in the context of American car retail, it was genuinely radical. The sales staff were retrained to match. Their job title inside Saturn's own documentation was closer to product consultant than salesperson. They answered questions, explained features, and walked customers through the purchase process. They were not paid on aggressive commission structures designed to reward pressure tactics. The entire incentive system was rebuilt to reward customer satisfaction scores rather than units pushed. The physical experience at delivery was designed to be memorable in a specific way. When a customer took delivery of their new Saturn, the dealership staff gathered and applauded as the car pulled out. It sounds small. For buyers who had spent years dreading the car buying process, it landed as something genuinely different. New dealer employees did not simply watch a training video. They spent a full week at the Spring Hill plant in Tennessee, walking the factory floor and meeting the people who built the cars they would be selling. The goal was to make every person at every Saturn dealership an extension of the same culture, not just a franchisee moving product. Saturn's advertising then told that story outward. Commercials focused on workers, on families, on the people behind the cars as much as the cars themselves. The brand was asking customers to trust a company built by people who cared, and the dealership experience was designed to prove that claim was not just a television script. In the summer of 1994, Saturn did something no automaker had ever done before. They invited their customers to come visit the factory. Not a press event, not a promotional stunt for journalists, a homecoming, open to anyone who owned a Saturn and wanted to make the trip to Spring Hill, Tennessee. Over 44,000 people showed up. They drove from every corner of the country, some caravanned in groups, organizing through local Saturn clubs that had formed organically, without any push from GM's marketing department. When they arrived at the plant gates and saw the building where their specific car had been assembled, many of them described it the way people describe visiting somewhere they had always felt connected to without ever having been there. The workers were there too. Assembly line employees stood outside and met the owners face to face. For a lot of those workers, it was the first time they had ever seen what happened to the cars after they left the line. The actual people who bought them, drove them, put their kids in the back seat. Both sides found it unexpectedly moving. That same year, Saturn recorded its highest annual sales, 286,003 vehicles. The 1 millionth Saturn rolled off the line by the end of 1995. J.D. Power customer satisfaction rankings consistently placed the brand at or near the top of the industry. These were not small achievements for a brand that had only existed since 1990. What the homecoming revealed was something harder to measure than sales figures. Saturn had built a customer base that did not just tolerate the brand, they identified with it. In an industry where loyalty usually meant buying the same model out of habit, Saturn owners were actively enthusiastic, publicly so, in a way that GM's other brands could not manufacture no matter how much they spent on advertising. The brand had become something rare, a community that happened to sell cars, rather than a car company that happened to have customers. For 6 years, Saturn had operated like a company within a company. Its own plant, its own union agreement, its own engineering team, its own retail philosophy. GM had allowed that because Saturn needed room to grow. By the late 1990s, the math had changed. Running a fully independent platform was expensive. Saturn's Spring Hill facility cost significantly more per vehicle to operate than GM's conventional plants. The brand was profitable in customer loyalty terms, but not in manufacturing efficiency terms. And inside a corporation the size of GM, the second number eventually outweighs the first. The directive came quietly. Saturn would begin sharing platforms with the rest of GM's global lineup. The L-Series sedan, launched in 1999, was the first signal. It was built on a platform shared with the Opel Vectra, a European GM product. The engineering team in Spring Hill had not developed it from the ground up. They had adapted something that already existed. The Ion replaced the S-Series in 2003, and the View SUV arrived around the same time. Both pulled heavily from Opel components. The cost savings were real. So was the loss. Saturn's founding logic had been that a clean slate design, built with a different process, would produce a different kind of car. The Ion was not a different kind of car. It was a rebadged product wearing Saturn's name. Dealers noticed first, then owners. The texture of the vehicles had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The interior quality that had defined the S-Series did not carry forward consistently. The sense that every design decision had been made for Saturn specifically rather than borrowed from a European parts bin, was gone. GM framed all of it as modernization. Shared platforms meant faster development cycles and lower costs, which was true. What the talking points did not acknowledge was that Saturn's entire identity had been built on refusing exactly that kind of compromise. The brand had promised to be different. Sharing platforms with Opel was, by definition, the end of that promise. The homecoming had happened 9 years earlier. The community was still there. The thing they had gathered around was quietly being hollowed out. When GM filed for bankruptcy in June 2009, the restructuring plan was blunt. Cut everything that was not core to survival. Saturn had already lost its independent engineering budget years earlier. Now, it lost its future entirely. GM announced it would either sell or close the brand. For a few months, it looked like a sale might actually happen. Roger Penske, the motorsport and automotive retail mogul, stepped forward with a serious acquisition offer. The plan was straightforward. Penske Automotive Group would buy the Saturn brand and dealer network, then contract a third-party manufacturer to build the vehicles. Saturn would survive as an independent marque, sold through its existing dealerships, no longer a GM product in anything but origin. Dealers who had spent years defending the brand to skeptical customers held on to that possibility. So did the Spring Hill workforce, even though the plant itself was already being retooled for other GM products. Then, in September 2009, Penske announced the deal was dead. No manufacturer had agreed to supply vehicles at terms that made the business viable. Without a production contract, there was no company to sell, only a name and a retail network. Penske walked away. GM confirmed Saturn would be discontinued. Production ended in October 2009, exactly 25 years after the company was incorporated. The Spring Hill plant continued operating, but building Chevrolets. Saturn dealerships were given until October 2010 to wind down. Roughly 350 franchises closed. The Saturn community did not disappear overnight. Owners kept their cars. The forums stayed active. Some of those original S-Series sedans were still running well past 200,000 miles, which had been the point. The product had worked. The experiment, measured as a business inside a corporation that ultimately needed returns more than it needed a philosophy, had not. GM had spent roughly $5 billion building a brand designed to prove American automakers could compete on quality. In the end, it was not Japan that finished Saturn. It was the balance sheet. Here is what Saturn actually left behind. No haggle pricing, once considered a radical experiment, is now a standard feature of how many dealerships operate. The customer-first retail model Saturn pioneered influenced brands from CarMax to modern electric vehicle companies building their own direct sales networks. Spring Hill is still running, producing Chevrolets on the same floor where the first S-Series came off the line. So the tools worked, the philosophy worked. GM just could not let them live inside a structure built to resist exactly that kind of thinking. That is the question Saturn never stops asking. GM created an entirely separate company because it admitted, publicly, that its own culture was incapable of competing with Toyota. Then, decision by decision, it rebuilt Saturn in the image of that same culture, cutting the independent budget, merging it back into shared platforms, subordinating the brand to internal politics. When the bankruptcy came, there was nothing left to save that GM had not already hollowed out. Was Saturn killed by the market, by GM's indifference, or by the simple fact that a corporation cannot escape itself just by incorporating a new subsidiary? Probably all three, and the ratio depends on which decade you look at. If you owned a Saturn, drove one, or worked at Spring Hill or a dealership, leave your story in the comments. Those first-hand accounts are genuinely worth reading. If this kind of deep dive into automotive history is what you come here for, subscribing keeps more of it coming your way. Thanks for watching.